This recombination of areas proved to make sense. Many of the turbulences that we have seen in the last few years after the disintegration of the Soviet bloc evolved in a European-Eurasian context. If you think about the Russian-Georgian War, for example, of 2008, or the enlargement of the European Union, the expansion of NATO, and so on. But this past year, we also saw the re-emergence of the Russian-Chinese nexus in a way that had been predicted only by very few analysts, and we saw this in a dramatic way. As scholars, we will need to find methodological approaches that allow for a refreshed dialogue between specialists on Europe, Asia, and Eurasia, a redefinition of area expertise, including in fields such as economics and cultural studies. I'm very glad that your conference has these fields, history, and society and culture all in its title. The Central Asia program of our institute, founded only 3 years ago, is such a framework that enables and requires and promotes such a dialogue. The accomplishments of this Central Asia program have been nothing short of astonishing, thanks to the efforts of its founder and director, Dr. Malene Laurel, and members such as Dr. Sean Roberts. It is thanks to their tireless work that the Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies is able to host this pioneering academic event, the first international conference on Uyghur history, culture, and society. It's an honor for me to open this conference today. I wish you an inspiring intellectual debate and many more such events in the future. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sean Roberts, and I'm here at the George Washington University and Director of International Development Studies at the Elliott School. I'd like to welcome everybody today to the first International Conference of Uyghur Studies. And it's a great honor and pleasure to have so many international experts on Uyghur history, culture, and society with us today. Over the last 20 years that I've been studying Uyghurs, whenever I tell people who do not know much about these people that I'm studying Uyghurs, they always say, well, you must be one of the only people in the world. And I always explain to them, no, that's not the case. I wish they could all be here today to see that, in fact, there is a very vibrant community of scholars who study Uyghurs around the world. And furthermore, the group that's present here today is only the tip of the iceberg. There's many more people that we would have loved to invite, but of course, due to limits of geography and resources, we could not accommodate everybody. But if this conference does not necessarily include the majority of people in the world who study Uyghurs, or even all of the most prominent ones, I'm fairly confident that the scholars gathered here today compose the most diverse group of scholars studying Uyghur history, culture, and society ever assembled for a conference. Scholars span the disciplines, with political scientists, anthropologists, scholars of literature, geographers, linguists, historians, etc. And they've come from many different countries, from Turkey, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and so on. I especially want to welcome today the many scholars who have come from the former Soviet Union to participate in this conference. There's a long tradition of Uyghur studies in the former Soviet Union. In fact, I'm always amazed that there's actually a word in the Russian language, one word that describes Uyghur studies, that's Uyghur. And it's, I think, very important because there's not been a lot of opportunities in the past for scholars from the US and Europe and Turkey to interact with scholars from Russia, from Central Asia. And this is really an opportunity, I think, to cultivate that relationship further going on. Along those lines, I want to explain one thing before I introduce the opening remarks of different speakers we have before you. I understand the name, the First International Uyghur Studies Conference, sounds a little bit conceited, and it's a little bit inaccurate in many ways. There's been many international conferences focused on Uyghur studies over time, and there's two in particular that have had significant influences on myself. One was at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in 2002, and we have some people, 2004, sorry about that. We have some of the organizers here, and a lot of the people who are participating in this conference also participated in that conference. And the other one, which I did not participate in, but it still has influenced me, took place in 1979 in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And the reason that influenced me is the first book I read about Uyghurs was this one, which is called Aktualny problemy sovietskого Uyghurovedения. And it was it's the proceedings of that conference, and it really introduced me to the fact that there was a plethora of scholars in the former Soviet Union studying Uyghurs. And it inspired me to study at the Institute of Uyghur Studies, or the Uyghur Shnoslik Institute, or the Institute Uyghurovedenia in Almaty, Kazakhstan in the 1990s. So I mention all that because the reason we called this the first international conference on Uyghur studies is not to suggest that it has no precedent, but it's more an aspiration, hoping that this will be followed by a second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on international conference in the future. So with that, one point of logistics, there are headsets and receivers for interpretation outside. The first channel has Russian language. The second channel has Uyghur, and the third channel has English. So we do have a very complex attempt to interpret the conference, so apologies if there's blips along the way, problems, but hopefully people will be able to understand all the speakers using the headsets.
Bugün aldı bilen ettigenliginlerge hayırlı olsun, hemmenlerge adi ihtiramlı.
I would like to extend my greetings towards all participants who came this morning. Мои пожелания, наилучшие пожелания всем участникам, чтобы вы сегодня пришли и вместе проводим это утро.
Men bir Uyghur buluş süpütüm bilen dünyanın hemme yeriden muşundaq japa tatip bir ömür Uygurning medeniyetin tadqiq qilgan olimlar bilen bir maydonda o'tdag'inimdan faxrlanaman.
As an Uyghur, I am very delighted to see you today. Those who are interested and invested their lives in the studies and studying Uyghurs. And I'm really glad to see you today this morning. Я очень, как уйгурка, я очень рада видеть сегодня рядом со мной таких ученых, которые посвятили свою жизнь, изучая нас.
Ben bugün şu bütün dünya Uygurlarının dünyadaki Uygurlar meselesini tadqiq qilgan olimlarni yig'ib bir yerga akilib, Uyghur medeniyeti üçün muşu yig'inni uyushtirgan George Washington Universiteti ve muşu yig'inni uyushtirgan Marla Hanım, Sean Robert ve muş barliq xodimlarga, rahbarlarga chin ko'nglimdan rahmat aytaman.
I would like to extend my sincere greetings and sincere gratifications to the organizers of such an important event, to the George Washington University's personnel, namely Marlene and Sean, and that they came with idea and they were able to bring in scholars who study culture and history of Uyghurs. Я также хочу выразить свою благодарность организаторам этой конференции и организатору это George Washington University и поименно Марлен и Шон в том, что они смогли все-таки привести в одну точку сегодня людей, которые изучают уйгуров, их историю, их культуру.
Bizdinki muşu medeniyetimizдің muşunda qattiq besim astıda yo'qab ketmay turishini hem muş medeniyetimizni qo'g'dab qolgan muş o'tdagan xodimlarga yana bir qitim rahmat aytaman.
So once again, thank you very much for people who try to safeguard disappearing culture and history of Uyghur people. Еще раз я хочу выразить свою благодарность тем, кто посвятил свою жизнь, защищая культуру и историю уйгуров, которые, к сожалению, сейчас исчезают.
Bu Uyghur medeniyeti, Uyghur tarihi, şu tarihte dünya tarihideki dünya hazinesiga özünün medeniyeti bilen nihayet zor töhfelerini koşkan bir medeniyet.
Uyghur culture is a rich culture which has contributed significantly to the world heritage, to the world civilization. Культура уйгуров, она очень древняя и очень богатая, которая посвятила, которая дала очень много мировой цивилизации и мировому сообществу.
Lekin hazır şu medeniyetini Xitay komünistleri tarafından yok etimiz, bütünlüğü yok buluş aldığa, intayın xatar girdabıga kip kalgan bir devir.
Unfortunately, this such a rich history and heritage is on the brink of extinction due to the Chinese Communist Party policies. К сожалению, эта богатая культура и наследие на пороге исчезновения из-за политики китайских коммунистов.
Mana şu medeniyetimizden kutuldurumuz diyen ilham toxtudek tinçlik beraber şu medeniyetimizden ne qoğdaş üçün kuraş qıqallar mana tönügündeki ilham toxtunu müddətsiz kəsdik ödünler mınlığan, onluğan adamlar muş Uygurlarının milli kimliği üçün turmidi yetivatıdı ve ölüvatıdı.
For instance, the case of Mr. Ilham Tohti, who was imprisoned, who was sentenced just a few days ago to the life in prison, just for advocating and voicing his concern on Uyghurs. There are many and like thousands and thousands of people just like him right now in China. К примеру, мы можем привести пример профессора Илхам Тохти, который был осужден на пожизненное заключение, таких как он, тысячи людей сейчас в нашем регионе.
Xitay hükümetinin bu kılmışı bütün dünyadaki tinçlikka can ilan kıgallığı hem Uyghur halkıga hem Uyghur halkının medeniyetine can ilan kıgallık dep karayımız.
We view this and we view this as a direct assault declared, as a direct war declared by Chinese government on Uyghurs and Uyghurs culture. Мы оцениваем эту позицию, наша позиция по этому поводу такова, мы оцениваем это как объявленную войну против уйгуров и культуру уйгуров китайским правительством.
Hazır dünyada bir hayvanatla, yokap gitvatkan hayvanatla üçün mü dünya halkı baş katırıp onu kutuldurup kılıvatıdır.
Right now, even the animal rights defenders, they voice concern for the extinction of certain species. That we came to that point that that on the same level of the complexity of the situation. Мы даже сейчас, скажем, в мире очень много организаций, мировое сообщество, когда они говорят, что нужно защитить права этих исчезающих животных, скажем так. И мы пришли к такой точке, критической точке.
Ben işinimen şu ortağın varlık tədqiqatçı xadımlar ve rehberler bizning medeniyetimizden bir ömür küreş kılıp qoğdap geldi. Hem bunun deyin ki Uyghur halkını, Uyghur halkının medeniyetini dünyanın bir gazinesi süpütüde qoğdap kalıdı da işinimen.
I believe that the participants of today's meeting, those who invested heavily in studying Uyghur culture and heritage, will continue their researches and they will keep raising the voice, safeguarding such a rich heritage which contributed to the world civilization. Я думаю, я надеюсь, что те исследователи, которые сегодня вместе с нами находятся здесь, они продолжат свои исследования и они продолжат поднимать этот голос в защиту уйгуров, и культуры и истории уйгуров. И вот эта вот позиция ваша, она приведет к тому, что будет услышан голос уйгуров в мировом сообществе.
Sizlerge bugün şunun bilen jığınınlarının muvaffakiyetlik içilişini ümit kılıman ve çin ko'nglimdan hammanglarning kelganiga rahmat aytaman, jığını uyushtirganlarga rahmat aytaman.
So once again, I would like to extend my greetings to all participants, and I would like to thank organizers of this conference, and I wish you the very best and success in your endeavor. Еще раз я хочу поблагодарить участников этой встречи. Я также хочу выразить свою благодарность организаторам этой конференции, и я надеюсь, конференция завершится с большим успехом.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thanks to the Institute for putting this event together. I flew back last night from Europe after a week in Europe, and I'm delighted to be here, but unfortunately I won't be able to stay for the whole day's conference, but it really is an honor to be here and also to follow just very briefly this morning in the footsteps of Rabia Kadir, for whom I have enormous respect and admiration, and really do want to pay tribute to her. It's a pleasure also to be one of the opening speakers with my esteemed colleagues here this morning, and I particularly want to thank Sue Bond, my friend and former colleague at Freedom House, for reaching out to me to participate in today's session. So many thanks for that. The Chinese regime in Freedom House's findings represents one of the greatest dangers to freedom, not only to the people who live in China, but beyond. The Chinese regime, along with the Putin regime in Russia and others, really are the greatest threats that we face to freedom, democracy, and human rights. Freedom House devotes a lot of attention and focus on the situation in China, afflicting many people, including that of the Uyghur community. Sarah Cook, our resident expert on the region, does outstanding work, and almost a year ago produced a special report about Chinese government efforts to censor not only within China, but beyond China, to try to influence the reporting and media coverage of China well beyond its borders. In 2008, when I was serving the State Department, I led the resumption of the human rights dialogue between the United States and China. And sadly, as you know, that dialogue led to nothing. Subsequent dialogues between the U.S. and China, unfortunately, have had similar results, as the human rights situation in China, for all concerned, has significantly deteriorated. We continue to ignore the human rights situation in China, and particularly for the Uyghur community, at our peril. For after all, the way a regime treats its own people is often indicative of how it will behave in foreign policy. And in fact, we do see the Chinese government and its leadership flex its muscles in the region and beyond. That's why I was at least heartened to hear President Obama this week make reference to Ilham Tohti's sentencing and imprisonment this week at the Clinton Global Initiative, and made reference to what has turned into an outrageous sham of use of judicial system to try to silence someone who has devoted his career to a dignified discussion that includes criticism of his country's leadership, but nevertheless hasn't even come close to the charges of which he has been accused. It is a travesty of justice, as others have said. It's a misuse and a miscarriage of the judicial system that is simply outrageous and scandalous. There really are no other words to describe it. And it is an affront to human rights and, frankly, simple human dignity. The situation in China and with the Uyghur community in the past 5 years, since protests that broke out in the summer of 2009, has shown that the government in Beijing has resorted to employing increasingly repressive measures to control the Uyghur community, which has become increasingly alienated and insulated as a direct result of this severe repression. Given that Uyghurs are mostly Muslim, China relies on the language of counterterrorism to frame much of its suppression of Uyghur human rights. Several hundred people have died in ethnic violence in the region, and in 2 attacks in Chinese cities and elsewhere over the past 16 months alone. China blames all these attacks on terrorists, quote unquote, linked to the pro-independence East Turkestan Islamic movement. But it's the government's heavy-handed anti-terrorism tactics that have repeatedly failed to stem the ongoing violence. And since little independent and outside media are allowed into the region, there's virtually no access to learn about actual developments on the ground. The authorities have also engaged in resettlement policies, in which they provide incentives for Han Chinese from other parts of the country to migrate and to settle into the Uyghur community. And this has exacerbated the already volatile tensions between the Han and the Uyghur communities. And authorities have recently also proposed a policy to limit the number of births to one child per Uyghur family. During the July 2009 crackdown, mobile phone systems and internet access were shut down, and China, of course, is one of the leaders in trying to control the internet, but also to use the internet for its own purposes, to promote its own propaganda. The access in Urumqi was not fully restored until May of 2010, and since then there has been increased surveillance, detention, and arrests of Uyghur bloggers and cyber activists, one of the most prominent being Ilham Tohti. In addition, China has implemented various restrictions on religious freedom, including closing religious sites, raiding Uyghur language schools, restricting Muslim dress and expression, including banning beards for men and hijab for women, and classifying any religious activity that might undermine its control as quote-unquote illegal. Let me end by noting that today is Rosh Hashanah. For Jews around the world, this is the new year. I myself am Jewish, and if I were really an observant Jew, I wouldn't be standing here before you, I would be in temple. But the very fact that I can decide myself whether I want to be here or in services is something that I hope Uyghurs and frankly everyone else can decide for themselves on how they want to practice their religion, promote their culture, make sure that the history and tradition of a very proud people is maintained and not undermined and vitiated. So it is on Rosh Hashanah that I wish a brighter new year and brighter future for the Uyghur community and for everyone else around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely pleased to be here to attend this, one of the rare conferences that devotes almost 3 days to a group of people who have been abused in their own country and have been ignored very conveniently by the international community. So on that note, this conference stands out as being the hope that something can happen, something should be done to protect the Uyghur community of their rights and survival. I mentioned the word survival, which Ms. Khadia mentioned about extinction, the possibility of the community that gets integrated. If you analyze the situation of the Uyghurs over the years, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. Not only the abuse by the Chinese authorities, but also complete indifference by the international community. It was better at one point, but it's getting worse. In Washington, we got involved to the Uyghur issue. At that time, to be honest with you, even I didn't know much about Uyghurs. When Ms. Kadir was arrested, David Kramer mentioned that outsiders are not allowed in. Actually, one of our Congressional Research Service experts on China was allowed in. And when Ms. Kadir went to see her, she was arrested outside the hotel and imprisoned for 8 years for providing information to foreigners So we brought that issue to the attention of the administration and to Washington at large, that you have a responsibility to get this lady outside the prison. Fortunately, after intense pressure, not only by us but other groups, US government also negotiated and eventually she was released. But the saga for her and the community did not end at that time. The children, one of her sons is still in custody. Whole family was pretty much abused and destroyed. I am saying bringing her case here is to explain the tragedy and the pain of Uyghur people. I mentioned the indifference part. When about 7-8 years ago, after Ms. Kadir was released, the tension was pretty intense, at least in Washington. President Bush met with her twice, not once, twice. It gives a strong impression to Chinese authorities and world at large that US government, as one of the main powers in the world, is ready to stand by the people of Uyghur, to recognize their suffering and the abuses they face. So that was, I would say, the high point. But unfortunately, for the last 6 years, we have been urging President Obama to meet with Ms. Kadir. The response was no response. They wouldn't say no, but no response. That's what I said. The international attention is drifting away. That's very dangerous. If President Obama feels very uncomfortable speaking about human rights or standing next to someone for symbolic reasons, the survival of the Uyghurs, then Uyghurs' future is going to be extremely bleak. So we have 2 years left for President Obama to meet. That's a challenge we have to put again. To symbolically meet her. You know what happened to Dalai Lama, he was refusing to meet them. Eventually he met. So when the US is not ready to take the leadership role in recognizing the abuses which has gone bad to worse recently for the Uyghurs, don't expect any country to stand up. It will be a miracle if they stand up, and we should actually give kudos to the leaders of the country if they stand up and speak up. Then I mentioned about the survival piece. It's not only religion, which is majority, overwhelming majority of Muslims. It's also ethnicity and even the right just to move around. You know, the area has been, they are becoming minorities in their own area. Even David Kramer mentioned about the religious, and no beer, nothing. But they don't even allow Uyghurs, especially the students and government workers, to observe fasting. Forcefully asking the students to drink water. Believe me, it is the only country in the world where we have seen the government is blatantly stopping people from fasting. I mean, you can't even fast, no right to fast, because it's connected to it. US also made a mistake, I am here because it's Washington, of indirectly helping China by putting one group, we are talking about 10-12 years ago, a very small group, called East Turkestan Islamic Movement, in the terrorist list. They have completely forgotten about that they have put it and Chinese are using it. When the previous US ambassador was visiting here, we were briefing him. And one of the issues was, wait a minute, you are there, make sure that they don't use this list. US have given the green light to abuse. He didn't even know that that was on the list. He was asking the other officials, so can you give me details? The question here is, for obedience, Uyghurs has been used at that point, so that there are other benefits US and international community can get. We have seen brutal attacks, imprisonment, torture, destruction, everything happening there. It may be a closed area. Tibetans also have the same thing. When Uyghurs fled, they were forced back by a lot of countries, fortunately not the US. Even the Muslim countries like China, not Pakistan, Malaysia, have been guilty because we thought at least you will have some sensitivity. But today, I know you didn't plan this anticipating about the recent developments in Iraq and Syria. I'm sure this is months in working. The perfect timing is that the whole rhetoric on this fear, which is genuine, by the way, what's happening in Iraq, Syria, and the expansion, which I cover, lot of countries, even from Malaysia, Indonesia, India, people are flocking to Syria to fight for this group. So that's an issue. And President Obama took a serious take that he himself chaired the UN Security Council meeting yesterday to pass a resolution. Unanimous, believe me, it's unanimous. Chinese, Russians, usually they don't care. Here everyone is united. Against whom is the question? Immediate future is against ISIS, whatever the group you call it. But the bigger picture is Muslims as a group of Islamic faith. That's what the danger we have to watch out for. That's why we should urge US and other countries to take a lead in having a same strong resolution at the Security Council itself in protection of Muslim rights. They could be minorities in a particular country, Muslim like in China, or even majority, where the governments may use this as a terrorist tool, as a tool to go after people whom they don't desire. In this case, Uyghurs will be at the worst end. You wait and see. Chinese must be smiling. I'm sure there are people here from the industry. Chinese must be smiling now. Wow, we got the endorsement of the Security Council. That's why our work is cut out. Our work means not only human rights groups, but people in general have to watch out. Not only Uyghurs, but Muslim communities around the world, that this cannot be accepted. As human rights groups, we have an extra liability. So we hope this conference have amazing panels. Please look into also the challenges that they are facing, if you can find, of this ISIS challenge that's popping up now. Because that's what is going to happen for the next, we don't know how many years. So we hope this conference, well organized, is repeat every year, because we have to keep the spotlight on Uyghurs. And we hope President Obama has some courage to meet with Ms. Kadir, as President Bush met twice, to send a strong message to Chinese. Thank you for joining hands at the General Security Council to fight against the ISIS group, but don't go after the people called Uyghurs simply because they are Muslims. Thank you very much.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm Mark Lagon. I'm a Georgetown professor, but I've been very happy to be colleagues of some of your panelists today. Kumar, you stole everything I was going to say. I'm very thankful to be with you here. I think it's quite important to not only have a disembodied discussion of U.S. foreign policy and of human rights, but of the cultural communities that have rights to live intact in the form they want. And we have typically in the United States looked at the issue of Tibet, and we need to understand that there is a deeply important other issue where Chinese repression, movement of Han Chinese for economic and political purposes into a region that's supposed to be autonomous has an impact on cultural identity and basic freedoms. I've learned a great deal from Rabia Kadir on the general issues of human rights as a State Department official, and even the complicated issues of human trafficking. We, those of us who are in the policy community in Washington, stand on our shoulders. But it is, of course, the people who live in East Turkestan who matter, and I commend those of you who are here to talk about this serious and intellectual thing. I just want to say a word about U.S. foreign policy. And here is where I joke that Kumar stole my theme, or I'm stealing his theme, whichever way you want to look at it. But it is important for the policy community in Washington, as we learn from those of you who are studying the texture of culture and history and autonomy in East Turkestan for the Uyghurs, that we not let counterterrorism provide to those who have repressive designs in Beijing their first talking point about an excuse, a pretext to squash culture, to squash basic rights, to squash religious liberties. I served in the Bush administration. I'm proud of that time, but we do need to recognize that when you have a so-called global war on terrorism, there will be those who will sweep up entire groups into a category and suggest they are terrorist by nature. It's an appalling disfigurement of the truth to suggest that all Uyghurs are by nature terrorists, if you are. And so it's the responsibility of the United States not only to raise with Chinese authorities the importance of the autonomy and rights of Uyghurs, but to be aware that as under the Bush administration or the Obama administration, we try and rally people to fight against virulent terrorist extremism, then we not give an excuse to those who would say, well, we are going to detain and repress groups of people based upon the pretext that they might be terrorists. I thank Rabia Kadir and her colleagues for inviting me to join in a small way, and I hope this is a very fruitful day. Thank you.
Good morning. I hate following my former boss, David, and Kumar, who thinks he's my boss, in presentations because they always steal my thunder. But I'm very honored to be on a panel with them. I'd like to welcome all of you to this really important conference. My Uyghur friends, who I've known for several years now, and especially Ms. Rabia Kadir and Omar Kanat, and also Sean Roberts. This is an extremely timely and important conference. My name is an unpronounceable one, so I will not be giving pop quizzes on how to pronounce it. But I have worked on human rights issues for over 20 years, and I am dating myself. I keep saying I started when I was 10, but it's a lie. I'm also a lapsed academic, so it's very nice to be back in the ivory tower whenever I'm allowed back in. So very pleased to be here. I first came to know Rabia Kadir about 13 years ago when I worked at Amnesty International. My good friend Kuma, who used to, I really had nothing to do with the work in China except on death penalty work, but he seconded me, as Kuma is wont to do, onto this prisoner of conscience case that he was working on. And I have to say that, I worked with Kuma for 9 years almost, and he worked on Ms. Kadir's case tirelessly. I mean, I have never seen someone so committed, so I really was inspired by his work, and also, was inspired by this woman who I had never heard of the Uyghurs until then, so it was a real education for me. The reason that this case resonated with me was she was a Uyghur women business leader who had been imprisoned for speaking out on behalf of her community. Not least, Rabia was a woman who had overcome considerable challenges in becoming one of Xinjiang's most successful business leaders. She was also unrelenting and fearless in speaking truth to power. In short, she reminded me of my own indomitable mom. Since I first worked on Rabia's case, I have become much more knowledgeable about the Uyghur community and also enjoyed their boundless generosity, friendship, and hospitality. However, as many of you know, much of the world still knows little about the Uyghurs, and this conference is an excellent forum that will raise their profile. Given recent developments in Xinjiang, which culminated in the travesty which my boss David mentioned and others, that was the trial and sentencing of Ilham Tohti earlier this week, this event could not have been timelier. Most people haven't heard of the Uyghurs. The few who have immediately associate them with Chinese Muslim quote-unquote terrorists. China's propaganda smear campaign has worked. In fact, it has been tremendously successful. Given the media blackout that exists in Xinjiang today, China is free to continue this disinformation campaign with impunity. China shapes the narrative of what the world sees and believes about the Uyghurs, and any challenge to that status quo within Xinjiang is dealt with harshly. And we've seen that repeatedly in case after case of people arrested for expressing free expression, for expressing their religion, for expressing dissent. So it is up to you all, the international scholarly community, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, whatever your discipline may be, it is up to all of you to provide the counter-narrative to China's version of the truth. I won't belabor the point of human rights abuse, which has been systematically leveled against the Uyghurs. My colleagues have chronicled that well in their presentations. Suffice it to say that jailing moderates on trumped-up charges, barring people from practicing their religion, language, and culture, and engaging in resettlement policies that are inherently inequitable and unfair are not ways to endear oneself to an already alienated community. Sometimes I just wish I could just get a PR firm. I'm sure they have PR firms in China, but a good PR firm to advise China on how to not alienate itself from minority communities which they rule. They're doing everything, if you look at PR sort of books, they're looking everything that's wrong in terms of trying to build friendship and reconciliation and affection with the community that you're working in. I hope the discussions today will lead to a better understanding of the rich history and contributions that the Uyghur community has made. I would like to conclude my remarks by recalling something that Ilham Tohti said in an interview in 2010. Quote, "The Chinese media's portrayal of the Uyghur people has nothing to do with reality. I respect and understand that the news media are trying to encourage ethnic harmony. But this approach leaves the voice of Uyghur people muffled. Truth be told, the Uyghur people have been forgotten by the world, both by the West and by the Islamic world. I know that this conference will live up to the promise that the Uyghur people have not been forgotten. I thank you for all your contributions and wish you a very productive meeting filled with meaningful debate and dialogue. Thank you.
Sayın katılımcılar,
Dear participants,
kültür derinliği ve etkileri açısından yeterince bilinmemesine rağmen dünyanın kadim halkları arasında en öndekiler arasında kabul edilmesi gereken Uygurlar üzerine bir toplantıya katılmaktan memnuniyet duyuyorum. Katılımcıları selamlıyorum.
I'm very pleased to be with you today and to participate to such an important meeting, which will be the subject of it, which will be discussion on Uyghurs. Although Uyghurs are not well known relatively in the world, nevertheless it does not undermine the importance and the heritage they possess. Я сегодня очень рад присутствовать и участвовать в этой конференции. Мы знаем, что уйгуры не очень хорошо известны мировому сообществу, и вместе с этим мы не можем, скажем так, underestimate, значит, мы не можем игнорировать тот факт, что уйгуры очень в большом плане и очень сделали большую контрибуцию мировому сообществу и мировому наследию.
Bana göre Uygurların en dikkat çekici yönlerinden biri, diğer Türk halkları gibi ana vatanlarını boşaltmadan binlerce yıl aynı topraklarda kültürlerini ve varlıklarını sürdürebilmeleridir.
To my mind, the important thing about Uyghurs is that for the 1,000 years, Uyghurs did not abandon their homeland, and they kept their identity and their cultural heritage among other Turkic nations. По моему мнению, уйгуры, как и другие тюркские нации, отличаются тем, и, может быть, характеризуются тем фактом, что на протяжении тысячелетий они не покинули свою исконную землю и сделали все, чтобы сохранить свою самобытную культуру.
Binlerce yıl süren kesintisiz bir süreklilik, Uygur kültürünün derinleşmesine birikimleriyle çarpıcı olarak diğer kültürler üzerinde ve onların uzantıları üzerinde etkili olmasına yol açmıştır.
Uyghur culture has also preserved its uniqueness and has also contributed to the enrichment of other nations' heritage and cultural linkage for the 1,000 years. Уйгуры также сопутствовали тому, что культура, такая культура была большим плюсом в отношении с другими нациями и также dala очень много другим цивилизациям и культурам.
Bu nedenle Uygur kültürünün tarihte Asya hatta Avrupa'ya doğru yayıldığını, etkilerinin sürdüğünü görüyoruz. Bu nedenle Uygur kültürünün Avrupa ve Asya'ya doğru etkilerinin tarihte olduğunu görüyoruz.
That's why, so by this we see that Uyghurs and Uyghur culture contributed a lot to Asian and European cultures.
Uygur kültürü ve birikimleri dünyayı etkisi altına alan geçmişte baskın güç olarak kendini gösteren imparatorluklara kılavuzluk etmiş, kaynaklık yapmıştır.
The Uyghur influence on other nations was on the extent, on imperial extent and their influence. And this way, and by this, it contributed a lot to the overall general world linkage.
Selçuklu İmparatorluğu'nun dip kültüründe Uygur kültürünün baskın etkilerini görürüz. Alfabesi de zaten Uygur alfabesidir.
For instance, we see a heavy Uyghur presence in the building of Seljuk Empire, and even the adopted script was based on Uyghur script.
Dünyayı bir dönem savaş ve yönetim dehası denilebilecek yöntemlerle etkisi altına alan, yöneten Moğol İmparatorluğu'nun, Cengiz Han'ın danışmanları bilge Uygurlardan oluşuyordu.
For instance, Mongol Empire, and which has contributed a lot and changed significantly the course of the world history, and was based and run by Uyghur advisors and by Uyghur intellectuals under Cengiz Han.
Binli yılların başında kurulan olağanüstü işlevsel posta ağının Tahran'dan Ulanbator'a bir haberin 2 günde gidebildiği ve değişmeden gidebildiği posta ağının yaratıcısı Uygur bilgelerdi, Uygur danışmanlardı. Bugün Windows sisteminin de esinlendiği söylenir bu yapıdan.
So, for instance, for the 1000 years, this communication tool was preserved, and I would like to highlight the example of the post, which was, like at the time, was able to send from Tehran to Ulaanbaatar, and it was taking only 2 days to reach that. So we can see that the heritage of some traces in nowadays Windows, intercommunication and globality.
Tarımda, medeniyette, sanatta ileri hamleler yapmış bu kültür bazen siyasi nedenlerle, bazen de iklimlerin değişmesiyle Asya'nın ve Avrupa'nın bazı alanlarına doğru yayıldığı, etkilerinin de onun paralel olarak yayıldığı görülür.
So, for instance, Uyghur culture can contribute a lot in development of agriculture and art, and for the reasons which might be contributed, the reasons like of the environmental changes and the political and historical changes. These influences have spread out so far, touching grounds in Asia and Europe.
Doğu Türkistan'da bugünkü resmi adıyla Sincan bölgesinde kullanılan onlarca müzik aletinin bugün İran'da, Rusya'da, Hindistan'da, Türkiye'de, Pakistan'da ve Asya'nın diğer bölgelerinde rastlarsınız. Bu kültürün etkilerini gözlerinizle görürsünüz.
In Eastern Turkestan, what is now called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, we can see musical instruments and the linkage, the traces can be found in the vast geography, including Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, subcontinental India, and etc.
Aynı şekilde tarihteki Uygur giysileri yine bu coğrafyaya da yayılmıştır.
So at the same time, the Uyghur influence was also spread out in these regions.
Türkiye'nin Avrupa yakasında duyduğunuz bir yerel şarkının binlerce kilometre uzakta söylenen eski bir Uygur ezgisi olduğunu,
the Turkic songs which you might come across in Europe and hear them in Europe are traceable back to Uyghur culture, back to Uyghur heritage, which is 1,000 kilometers away.
Bunu öğrendiğinizde bu kültürle ilgili daha çok bilgilenmek istersiniz.
So when you learn these facts, you are interested to learn more and more of that.
Bunlara rağmen Uygur kültürü ile yakından ilgilenmek istediğinizde, bu büyük kültüre yaklaşmak istediğinizde bu alanın çok eksik araştırıldığını, birçok dünya imparatorluğuna kılavuzluk etmiş bu birikimin üzerinin örtülü olduğunu görürsünüz.
And when you approach and you wish to study this rich culture, rich heritage, you realize that there are many areas of research which are not completed, and they have to be covered by extensive studies.
Değerli katılımcılar, günümüz şartlarında yeni bir küresel kutup olmaya, bir küresel süper güç olmaya aday dev bir ülkede bu kültür ve kadim halkla ilgili araştırmalar son derece azdır.
For instance, the country which positions itself as a superpower, such studies are restricted and very limited in the areas of the above mentioned interests.
Yasaklar etnik kültürler üzerine örtülmüş çarşaflar gibi her yerdedir.
The restrictions which are imposed, like the material which covers up the heads, are existent, and we are witnessing this. The existence of it, we are witnessing.
Çin devleti bu konularla ilgili araştırmayı, bu konularla ilgili olan araştırmaları yasaklı konular arasında görmektedir.
Chinese government sees such researches and characterize them as illegal.
Çin süper güç olarak uluslararası arenaya çıkarken politikalarını yumuşak ve müdahaleci olmayan bir tarzda geliştirmek istediğini, en azından kendinin böyle algılanmasını istediğini ifade etmektedir, arzu etmektedir.
So China positions itself as a soft power, which is projecting its might through diplomacy and soft power. But however, we see this that it's contrary. The action of the government is contrary to its proclaimed goals.
Dünya halkları sorgulayacaklardır.
So the world community will ask about this.
Bir yandan Çin'in dünya ekonomisine sağladığı dinamizm övülürken,
So on one hand, we are witnessing the dynamics and the dynamism of the Chinese economy,
ve Çile çekmiş Çin halkının şartlarının iyileşmesi olumlu bir hava yaratırken uluslararası toplum soracaktır.
So at the time when certain tools and certain advantages are kept and provided for Chinese people, there are some overlooked areas to which international community will help accountable China.
Çin şu anda çok büyümüştür.
China has gained tremendously its power.
Oxford'da ve Pennsylvania Üniversitesi'nde yapılan araştırmalara göre satın alma paritesine göre ABD'yi 2 yıl önce geçtiği dahi iddia edilmektedir.
According to the studies conducted by Oxford and Pennsylvania universities, the purchasing power of China surpassed the one of the USA in the last few years.
Çin yeterli kalkınma ve teknoloji gücüne sahip olduktan sonra
Once China gained its power and tools of economic development,
dünya barışına ve istikrarına nasıl katkıda bulunabilecektir?
We can ask ourselves in what position China will need to contribute to the world stability and security.
Bugün için Çin'in ürettiği mallar, Çin'in egemen olduğu sahadaki davranışları da Çin halkının bugün için Çin'in ürettiği mallar kadar Çin'in egemen olduğu sahadaki davranışları da Çin hakkında referansları oluşturacaktır.
So we can judge Chinese influence not only by seeing commodity merchant products which China produces, but also by the Chinese behavior itself per se.
Bugün Çin topraklarında yaşayan halkların yönetime katılımları,
In today's China, the participation of people in its governance,
temsil edilmeleri,
in self-representation,
kültürlerini sürdürebilmeleri,
in continuation of and preservation of their cultural identities,
nüfuslarının büyük Çin nüfusu içinde eritilmemeleri,
and the instances of not assimilating within the greater Chinese ethnicity,
katliamlara,
the massacres,
sürgünlere,
forcing exodus,
etik dışı tıbbi deneylere ve silah deneylerine maruz kalmamaları,
unethical medical studies and operations,
ve uluslararası varlıklarını özgürce ifade edebilmeleri konusunda durum bugün Çin'de nedir?
So we can ask ourselves, what is the current situation and position of China on the above-mentioned reference points?
Dünya halkları bunları soracaklardır.
And I believe that international community will ask China on that.
Küresel bir kutup olmaya aday olan Çin'in insan hakları karnesi nedir?
What is the position of China, which positions itself as a universal power?
Hedeflenen pozisyonun sorumluluklarını gelecekte üstlenebilecek midir?
What are the responsibilities of China, which is targeting high marks.
Söylemlerinde ne kadar samimi olacaktır?
And to what extent is Chinese government is sincere? China is sincere.
Bütün gelecek tahminlerinde, fütüristik tahminler ve bunlarla ilgili raporlarda şöyle belirtiliyor.
So all futuristic predictions and analysis are saying the following.
Birkaç yüzyıldır batıda oluşmuş ve varlığını sürdüren küresel gücün, birkaç yüzyıldır
The universality which was established for the last few hundred years in the West,
bu güç, batıdaki güç artık bundan sonra önümüzdeki dönemlerde küreye yayılacağı farklı coğrafyalarda kendisini göstereceği söylenmektedir bu gelecek tahminlerinde.
it is predicted that the Western concepts of universality will spread out in other regions.
Yani dünyadaki küresel güç batıda odaklanan dünyanın çeşitli coğrafyalarına doğru yayılacak.
So Western-based and Western-born concepts of the universality will spread out across the world.
Küresel sistemde yaşanacak bu değişimin insanlığa ve onun kurulması gereken sisteme, küresel sistemde yaşanacak bu değişikliğin insanlığa ve onun için kurulması gereken sisteme hizmet etmesi gerekir.
So the principles of universality should be applied and to the service of the whole community, of the world community. So the norms and the tools and the measures in implementing these universal rules of governance should be moderated, should be revised, and should be updated, so they can serve better to the greater public.
Yeni küresel güçler,
New universal powers,
yeni bölge güçleri ekonomik olarak büyüyeceklerse,
if they will grow up economically with this, in the respective areas,
nasıl ki onların ürettikleri mal ve hizmetler dünyada kabul görüp serbestçe dolaşabiliyorsa, bu serbestliğin ve kabul görüşün bu sayede gerçekleşebildikleri büyümenin karşılığı ve bedeli olması gerekir.
so when these powers produce and spread out their influence by their products and their services, at the same level, the freedom and principles of universality should be applied by the same powers which are project themselves as being world powers.
Bu bedelin standartları uluslararası toplum tarafından koyulmalı. O ülkenin insan haklarına, hukuka, sahip oldukları kültürel dünya miraslarına, bu miras ve varlıklarının yaşamsallığına verdiği önem ve özen olmalıdır.
So these universal standards should be applied by international community and in implementing and fostering the rights on human rights issues, on the issues of the world heritage and preservation of this heritage, also by giving an importance to such universal tools and methods.
Kısaca bu konferans vasıtasıyla Çin'in dünya sahnesine süper güç adayı olarak çıkışında kendi etnisiteleri ve onların kültürlerinin korunmasında ve devamlandığında göstermelik olarak değil, gerçek yaklaşımlarda bulunmasını beklediğimizi ifade etmek isteriz.
So shortly, I would like to mention that having such conferences and realizing this conference, we have to highlight that Chinese superpower and its position and its role in the world community should be judged not by declared statements, but by the real action of this country in preserving cultural heritage, especially ethnic minorities, and in preserving their cultural heritage and culture. So by this we can judge Chinese behavior.
Bu konu hem dünya barışına hem de hızlı büyüyen bir devin iç istikrarına hizmet edecektir.
So by doing this we will contribute not only to the world stability, but also to the China itself, which is growing tremendously and gaining economic power.
Çin'in Orta Asya'ya doğru başlattığı yayılmacı politikası nedeniyle Sincan bölgesine yatırım yapıyorsa, bu bölgeyi Çinli nüfus lehine nüfuslandırıyorsa, Uygurlar aleyhine nüfuslandırıyorsa, bunu yaparken Uygur önderlerini çeşitli gerekçelerle tutuklanıyorsa, Çin'in radikalizmle mücadele ediyoruz çağrısı uluslararası toplumu ikna etmeyecektir.
So the policies conducted by China, as we can see right now, in limiting freedom of expression, in throwing the Uyghur intellectuals into prison, and the mass migration into the region of ethnic Han Chinese, and its growing influence and power in Central Asia, cannot convince us, the international community, in its real and sincerity of the policies of the China, which is proclaimed to be so.
Radikalizm, haksızlıkların yaygınlaştığı, fikir ve ifade özgürlüğünün daraldığı, baskıların çoğaldığı ve krizlerin sıkça yaşandığı alanlarda beslenir ve bunlar sayesinde büyür.
Radicalism and political marginalization breathes on the ground when there are no freedom of expression is allowed, when there is no room for the expressing themselves without fear of being persecuted. So that's breeding ground for such policies.
Özgürlük, yeterli bir eğitim ve kendini ifade edebilmenin yaygın olduğu toplumlarda radikalizmin gelişmesi doğal olarak daha az olacaktır.
So in the areas, at the time when the self-expression is limited, when there is no liberty, this is given that radicalism will flourish in it.
Bugünün gelişmiş ülkelerinden Asya'daki yeni güç farklılaşmalarının sadece silah ve güvenlik boyutuyla değerlendirilmesi değil, yeni şartlara göre bölge temelinde dayanan yeni ekonomik işbirliklerinin temel yaratacak, bu konuda temel önlemler alabilecek dengelenme konusunda yeni ekonomik işbirliklerinin geliştirilmesini desteklemeleri gerekir.
So the international community should be involved in the moderation and updating the new conditions and new tools which will allow the development and overall development, and not solely relying on the power of weaponry and force.
Ekonomik işbirliklerinin desteklenmesi, tek bir hakimiyeti önleyici, alternatif bir reel ekonomik bölgenin oluşturulmasına, ekonomik bölgelerin oluşturulmasına katkılarını beklemek daha akıllıca olacaktır.
I would suggest that it would be more wise to suggest the following: the avoidance of monopoly on the development tools and providing more alternatives for the overall development and contribution of the basic basis.
Bu konuda bölgenin büyük ülkelerine, Türkiye, Rusya, Hindistan dahil büyük işler düşmektedir. Çok teşekkür ederim.
So I think that superpowers like China, Russia, and India should contribute more in that. Thank you very much for your attention.